was like, that was so powerful. It's just stuck in my mind forever. I don't want to be one of these people who wakes up from a dream every day and says, oh, that was a nice dream. Started to really be very curious about climate change, and what sort of world I was going to be part of leaving for my children. We are in a time now where rapid transition is the only way out of what we're in. And that was my sliding door moment of kind of learning how fear can sometimes really interrupt something that's going to be brilliant for your career. And going to Antarctica was such a turning point in my life, a turning point in my perspective on climate change. I always remember we had a satellite phone, and I always remember the phone going off, and I realized it was somebody calling me from home. And it was my 9-year-old daughter asking me where her soccer shorts were. And I was just like, okay, so hang on a sec. I've got to just change, put my mothering hat on.
I'm on a mission to help early stage startup founders. So I'd like to ask you one thing, and that is to subscribe or follow my channel. This helps the channel to grow and in turn to help early stage startup founders on their journey. Today I'm very excited to have a very famous person on my podcast, a very famous filmmaker in a very important space that's had a really amazing life journey. On the Fail Wisdom podcast, welcome Liz Courtney.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you for that introduction. It was a little unnecessary, but it's great to be here with you today.
Well, I got a bit more here, introduction. So you're an award-winning international film director who changed her stilettos to snow boots after a very successful corporate career, and recently was awarded Global Gold in the Women Changing the World Awards in London. So let's start with why did you do this? Change your shoes? Do you like the snow or skiing?
Well, I have to tell you, snow boots are much more comfortable to stilettos. But why did I change? Well, you know, I'd had nearly 20 years in the corporate sphere, and I think it was around the same time when I had our 3 children quite close together, and I had been part of an agency that we had built up and sold to the US. So I had taken maternity leave for a year thinking, yeah, I'll be back, you know. But I think after having our first child, Dakota, I realized that I really was looking for a bit more depth in my life and what was life all about and how was I contributing. And I started to really be very curious about climate change and what sort of world I was going to be part of leaving for my children. And that started me on my own journey to think I'd like to look at how I could tell some stories. I'd always been fascinated by film, and I was in communications and marketing. So I sort of started to spread my wings and have a look about what could I do and how could I use my skill set of communications, but more in the filmic world.
Interesting. And so what was life like in the corporate world? Because I hear lots of stories, and many startup founders come from the corporate, and a lot of them are actually burnt out, working very long hours. And what was your experience in the corporate world?
Well, experiences, I guess, are sometimes also what you make them. So I know that I fell into public relations, I have to say, purely by accident. And I had one of those fun moments when I was finishing uni at Monash and in Melbourne, and we all decided to go and do something for Farm Week. It's always this great challenge, like what silly thing can you do? And so a group of us thought we would actually go and audition for a television series. That was the silliest thing we could think of doing. And we all rocked up and we did these auditions, and surprisingly I got a call back, and I ended up being on a television series for a year, which my parents were like, just go finish university. I'm like, I'm just going to take a year off. I'll try this.
Get a real job.
Get a real job. And, you know, it was very interesting to meet all the people, see how all the behind the scenes worked. But I kind of was interested in the industry, but I didn't have the patience to sit in the green room for half the day. So I kind of knew that I wanted to do things that were very engaging.
Yeah.
And somebody said, have you ever thought of doing public relations? And I was like, what's that? And they said, well, you like writing, you're creative, you've got a lot of energy. Why don't you go and have a chat to someone about it? And I did have that chat. And that chat led to me being offered a job. The reason I mentioned this is that when I got into that industry, and I absolutely loved it because every day was different, I kind of set myself goals that I wanted to get to certain places, and I wanted to be a managing director kind of by the time I was in my early 30s. And that was just my own personal goal. So I think I worked really hard towards setting milestones and goals of the things I wanted to achieve. And I was very lucky to have some wonderful mentors that came along during that time that helped me, and I had a focus to get where I wanted to get. And kind of when I got there and I ended up moving to Sydney, I realized how important it was to, one, work to achieve what you're wanting to do, right? But when you get to that position, how important it is to put back into the new recruits that are coming forward. So I created a little program called the JAM program, which was the Junior Account Manager program.
Okay.
And I thought in the senior management, there were, probably 100 years of experience between all these people, but we were never sharing it. So I kind of worked to put that back and chose a number of young recruits every year. And we worked with them every month just to share our knowledge and help them grow faster in the organization.
Yeah.
And so I think my take on working in that industry was a lot of young people, I felt, came in with invisible boundaries. And when you started to work with them, you realized that they had been told something in their life. You'll only be a this, or you'll only be able to be a that, either by parents or school teachers or aunts or uncles. And so they kind of didn't have the bigger vision, and they didn't have the bigger dreams.
Yep.
And so while we were always, as consulting, because we're an agency, we always had financial goals and pressures and all of that, I was very conscious of how important it is to also share your knowledge to help build others up. So I hope that we created quite a welcoming and nurturing environment. I won't say that that is always the case. And I think it's important to moderate work, life, health, and mental wellness. They all have to be well looked after. It's like having a garden, and if you're only watering one bit of the garden, the other bits of the garden are going to suffer.
Yeah, that's really important. It's quite a big topic on a lot of my podcasts. Looking after your well-being, your mental health, because a lot of founders, and it is really stressful. You start off and you've got a million things to do, and you've got a million stresses, and some work 7 days a week, 14 hours a day, but and a lot of people in corporate as well, and just about all of them burnt out like that. So you have to try and maintain a balance and look after your mental health and well-being. So that's really important. And so just going back, so you're in the PR space, public relations. I think that would be an excellent background to be a startup founder, because selling, so to speak, and I guess PR is like selling, but in a subtle way, I think, getting the word out there, and that having that as a background as a founder, I think would be really, really important and really a great background to have, because sales and marketing is the hardest thing to do. If you can't sell, you got the best film or product or whatever in the world. If you can't sell it. So do you think that contributes to some of your success, that background in PR, being able to sell yourself?
Yeah, definitely. You've definitely picked up on that, and I 100% agree. I think the skill set that I developed going into the film industry just gave me so much help, because I already had 20 years of corporate, of running a business, of doing balance sheets, pitching, winning clients, but also asking the questions like, what's the unique selling proposition of this product? What else is in the market? Are you unique? Is it a hero product? Are you a Me Too product? Who's your target audience?
Yeah.
Is there a segment within that audience you're particularly selling to? And I think when you're making a film, you have to ask yourself, what genre is that film going to be? Is it history? Is it ancient history? Is it science and technology, health? What is it? Because around the world, some of those topics or genres are shrinking, some are expanding, and then some are not being carried anymore on free to air. Some are more being carried on streamers. So it's like really understanding the landscape or the market that you're trying to play in.
Yeah.
Very important.
Yeah, it's exactly. And the same in startups. You got to know who your target audience is. You got to research that really well. And then you got to go out and see if it's what you're doing is viable as well.
Yeah.
Because
And I always say to startups, and I say to people in film, is you have to know what your elevator pitch is. Like if you bump into someone in the street and they say, they haven't seen you for a while, what are you doing? You have to be able to say in less than 2 minutes, I'm doing this, explain what it is, what the benefits are, and how you're approaching the rollout of it. The other thing I think is that never be afraid to ask for help and find a couple of good mentors. I can't stress enough, one of the series that I worked on was going to be a global series, and I had to make a version of it for the US market.
Yep.
And I was told to find someone who could help me understand the US market. And I'm like, Australia, US, UK, they can't be that different. And I was like, it's the subtle things like in America, they call a bush a brush, and they have a different name for runners, and they have a different name for certain things. And it might sound really slight, but it actually just highlighted the fact that that particular market, I needed to have someone to mentor me in that market. And also how to do, we were talking about this before, how to create time clocks, because the US market always looks for time clocks in the programming, and it's usually 42 minutes and 28 seconds. And I think I could lecture on US time clocks now because I had to learn it. It was super hard.
Yeah.
But I reached out and I asked someone who's become an amazing mentor in my life, Steve Burns, who worked in Discovery Channel and National Geographic. And I met him at 1 or 2 conferences. I had his card. He's the sort of person who would always give a keynote address.
Yeah.
But I approached him and he said, yes, I'd love to help you. What can I do? Amazing.
Yeah, I think mentors can be really important, but I often talk about mentor whiplash, where particularly when you're starting, you get mentors, you might be in an incubator space and, talk to one mentor says this, one says that, one says the other. And then if you're really new, you don't know much, your head just spins. And in the end, you've got to go with your intuition, I think, and you got to go with those mentors that you can really relate to, and that when they, give you some advice or whatever it might be, and maybe the good ones don't give advice, like I'm trying to avoid now advice on this podcast because you can give advice, but it's different for everybody. So just listening to people's stories, I think is the best way to go about that. But having a really good mentor is really important. For sure.
I also say to people, having a compass. So, if you're navigating out at sea or you're in a desert or you're somewhere, you need a compass to help you know the direction you need to go in because you've got a destination that you're aiming to get. And I sometimes say to people, create a compass and a direction and a point so you know where you're going. So every time you kind of move away from that direction and that compass, you have something that brings you back to that, because it's really really easy, I think, to get thrown off track. And you only realize that maybe 2 weeks later and you think, hang on a second, wow, I am so far off track. How did I get there? It's like this big wind came through and swept you off somewhere. And so then you kind of got to clamber back and get on track again. Yeah. And I think always checking into kind of your why and where you're going and what your goals are to get where you've got to get to, and just handpick a small group of people. I think having someone who understands PR and branding is really critical for a startup. Understanding how to practice pitching and discussing things with people, and also reading the room. So you can be in a situation and you've got to make sure the people at the table or in the room, you can read the room to get a sense of what the vibe is, or get a sense of who's leaning in, who's really interested versus who's just there to kind of tick a box.
Yeah, it's interesting. So with pitching, what do you think about having a script or not having a script?
I think it depends on the individual person. I don't like to be scripted because on the day I can read the room or get a sense of people. So I might change things up a little bit, but I definitely always have bullet points. Mm-hmm. And those bullet points are to remind me of what the most critical key things are that I need to say or I need to share. And there's always something that I reflect on and think it's really important for them to hear that 3 times. So during my conversation, I will make sure I drop that particular point in 3 times. Yep. If it's like I have secured the book rights to this story, that's a really unique thing in a film or a documentary. I'll make sure I drop that in 3 times in my conversation. Because I think if you retrofit it and you say, when people leave this room, leave this presentation, what are the 2 or 3 key things you want them to remember?
Yeah, and that's all I remember. 3 is
that's
max,
it.
right?
That's it. Yeah. So make sure that you have worked that out. Yeah. So when you're pitching and presenting, know what you want them, what the takeouts are you want them to take home with. Yeah. And if there's a takeout that you want them to go home with and you give them, I'm making this up, a jar of jam, but it's got a unique taste of
Antarctica.
Yeah, or of Moree honey or something like that. Yeah. You know, they'll walk away with that because that's the thing you were talking about was a unique taste or a unique smell or a unique something in the so give them also something that they can, a little something, it's not going to cost you the world at all, that they can just walk out of the room with, a mug, a shopping bag with something printed on it, like whatever it is, so they remember.
Or something they can visually see, something, you know. I was at a pitch event about a month ago, and this fellow, he had something for, you know, the bins. So, here we got the yellow, the red and the green, all those bins, right? So if you're going to put something in the recycle bin and it's not the right thing, it won't open. So it'll open if it's the right thing. And it was just, the pitch was really short, but it's like, oh, wow, that's amazing, you know, because he just showed it, and that's so powerful if you can do that.
I mean, pictures do tell a big part of a story, or digital content. I don't think you want to have many points on your slide. Pictures are better with only 1 or 2 words. You tell the story. Yep. The picture's there to set dress you like you're in a theatre. It's behind you. It brings up the vision or brings to life some sense of what you're talking about. Yeah. But when you've got lots of content on a slide, you're going into the analytical part of the brain all the time. And I think you need to kind of give them the big picture and take them into a creative space so that they can actually get a sense of what it is that you're really so passionate about and why you want to bring it to market.
Yeah, it's interesting because I also interviewed Hollywood director Mark W. Travis on this show, and he used to do a lot of one-man shows with very famous people. And it's just like when you see a comedian, right? There's a stool, there's a comedian, that's it. There's no backdrop. And there was one where the whole show was about this guy's mother, right? And he wanted to have a picture up of his mother. And Mark said no, because they're going through the show and everybody's got a different picture in their mind relating probably to their mother or whatever it is. And if you put that up, it sort of spoils it for them. So sometimes I think pictures would work even better just without any deck or anything on the wall or any images. So, Now, Liz, you could say started in the startup, or you had your first, or one of your first companies that was a hobby that came about by accident in secondhand clothing. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. Well, I was very, as I came out of my traditional corporate role and was switching into setting up a production company and doing film, I realized that a lot of the clothes I had in my wardrobe and my suits and my shoes, I really wasn't wearing them. I didn't think I needed them anymore. I actually didn't really know what to do with them. And I think we're going back a good 15 years. So places like Dress for Success and others that are fabulous now that have started kind of weren't there at the time. And I had a colleague who had also been a marketing director at another company. She had the same aha moment that she was really looking for a life change. So the two of us together went, but what do we do with all our clothes? What do we do with our shoes? And we had many other women talking about this sea change in life. So we thought, well, maybe we'll just start a small website. We can put these clothes up. We can resell them. People who might change over their wardrobes quite regularly.
What year was that? What year was that?
Oh, you're asking me there. I'm going to say around 2007. I could be wrong.
Yep.
But it was around that time. And it was still quite expensive to build websites. They were still a little bit clunky.
Yeah.
And when you hadn't been in the tech space at all, even clunkier to use and work out, we had one built. I won't talk about how much it costs because nowadays it would be like a fifth of the price. And then how do you actually take images, load them, get them looking beautiful? That technology's come such a long way. But we found that there were many people that were interested in this, and suddenly we were getting people hearing about it, and we suddenly started to get more and more and more clothes. And we ended up with like about 4,000 items, and we set up a small store that someone was kind enough to let us have at a really reduced rate for a while, just as a pop-up. But then we had to manage a website. We had to manage a store because we were both also working at the time. We had to employ people to run the store. And suddenly this whole thing, it was also picked up on one of the television networks. We had 10,000 people hit the website one night, made the website fall over. So all these things, we didn't realize how time-consuming it was. And we didn't have really streamlined processes. We had a lot of interest. We didn't have the right infrastructure. And we were two novices that just had an idea, but we just didn't understand the technology well enough to really drive it. And we kept it going for about 2.5 years, after which we both were exhausted because there was just so much to do at the end of every day that we closed it down. But if it was running today, we would have had – we had people who would be getting on a plane and they would see that we just had someone who'd come up with a high fashion brand wallet. It was a Chanel or a Versace. I mean, we were getting extraordinary brands of women coming in with these things. And they'd be pinging, getting on the plane saying, I'm buying it. I'll do the transaction as soon as I land. Don't sell it.
Really?
I mean, I just remember these amazing things that were happening. And we were just ahead of our time, and we didn't truly think enough ahead about the structure that we needed and possibly how fast it would ramp up. And so we just hadn't built a long runway of how to start it up and move it forward. And it never occurred to us to also think there could be people interested in putting seed money into this because it could grow. And it was a really early adopter in sustainable fashion. But we were too early and we didn't think about the ramp up. That's what I would say.
So, too early and then too fast.
Correct.
So that often happens in the startup world. My startup was virtual reality, starting in like 2017, and it was too early. The technology wasn't there. The headsets were clunky or Google Cardboards, and now would be a perfect time for me to do the startup. So we thought we were amazing because we were like the first in Australia, but that actually is not really an advantage. Usually second, third, or whatever. Yeah. And then so ramping up. So I guess with your PR background as well, you got onto some shows, and then you had that massive amount of people coming, and you had to be ready for that.
Yes, we didn't quite realise the volume
Yeah.
and how fast. And we do lament about it some days but nowadays we kind of have other things that we do in where I live. There's a group of mums and we're all kind of similar sizes, but we have community wardrobes. And so we just kind of share shirts. People will come and like take 2 or 3 shirts out of someone's wardrobe and wear for a few months and drop them back. And we try to be sustainable in how we think about fashion and other things that we do in our area. And I think that's just a great community engagement that we can have. And I think my very first true sliding door moment, I think I was mentioning a bit earlier when we were having a chat, was when I got to go to Antarctica for the first time.
Yeah, so it involves 40 teenagers, right?
That's right.
Tell us that story.
Yeah. Well, I had done a couple of contracts with ABC and SBS, and I was asked if I would consider directing something that was happening in Antarctica. And I remember going home and I had seen a film probably a few weeks prior to that where somebody was at sea in a boat in this huge, massive storm and the boat kept getting tipped upside down. And I kind of had this in my mind when I was asked if I wanted to go to Antarctica and I would be going on the Drake Passage. So for anybody listening, the Drake Passage is known to be one of the most hazardous areas to voyage across. And it's a very tiny area between the southern point of Chile and the top of the western peninsula of Antarctica. But it's where 2 huge oceans literally smash into each other. And so it's pretty choppy would be an understatement. But I thought, my kids said, why aren't you going? It's such a great opportunity. And this is where I think sometimes you have these moments in life where you have to think, what's holding me back? And I realized personally it was my own fear of taking that step and going on that expedition and crossing that sea. And it wasn't any of the things I pretended it was, like who's going to cut your lunches, who's going to shoot the lunch boxes, who's going to get you to school, can Dad manage all of this? Like
Poor Dad.
all of those, poor Dad, all of those things, right? They're probably thinking, yes, we can stay up later and go, Mum. But I did call back the next day and said, come on, let's do it. And that was my sliding door moment of kind of learning how fear can sometimes really interrupt something that's going to be brilliant for your career moving forward. And going to Antarctica was such a turning point in my life, a turning point in my perspective on climate change, having the lived experience. There's nothing that can compare to that lived experience. Also hearing 40 teenagers in my ear for 3.5 weeks about what we weren't doing for their future world and the why. And thinking, I have had this amazing opportunity, so ever grateful, and what a privilege. What am I going to do with this experience? Am I just going to sit back and say, I had that experience?
Yeah.
Or am I going to do something with it?
Yeah. And you've done a lot since then.
I have. But there was a wonderful First Nations young man who was on our expedition, Malcolm Lynch, and I always hold this in my thoughts. I said to him, Malcolm, what did you learn from going on this expedition? Not only was he the first First Nations person, along with Narelle Long, to step foot on Antarctica, and they're in the Guinness Book of Records now. Right. And we didn't know that until we were nearly in Antarctica. I said, what did you learn? And he said to me, there are people who dream and wake up from their dreams, and there are people who dream and make their dreams a reality. And Wonderful. He said, that's what I've learned. And I was like, that was so powerful. It's just stuck in my mind forever. And I knew I had big dreams. And I thought, I want to make my dreams a reality. I don't want to be one of these people who wakes up from a dream every day and says, oh, that was a nice dream.
Yeah. I mean, they say like the biggest regrets people have when they're, dying, always like, oh, if only I had taken more opportunities and done more. It's not like, oh, thank God I played it safe and just, stayed in the same job or whatever. So that's really interesting. So that you came back from Antarctica, and so did you get into film before that? 'Cause you said,
So while we were finishing off this recycled fashion, I had already started to set up a small production company, and I had landed my first contract with ABC, and I did Sculpture by the Sea. So I thought my first one, I pretty much thought I knew how to do it, and I had a good crew. And then the ABC said to me, we'd also like you to deliver it in Chinese. I was like, what? Because there was a very famous Chinese sculptor in the exhibition, and they wanted to play it in China. So that was like, I'm going to sink or swim on this one because I have to do it in 2 languages. Anyway, so did that, and I landed quite a big primetime series with ABC. With SBS to make a series called Angels in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And myself and another wonderful filmmaker, Gregory Miller, with the 2 of us were involved in doing that. And it was my first sort of big international following 2 amazing Chinese Malay boys who were taking a project that they developed at Sydney University, and they were taking it to try and get it off Broadway. And so we followed them the whole way through the design, the casting, traveling around America casting, having the big costumes made, going to Kentucky, learning about how to fly on stage because there's a lot of flying because there's a lot of angels that flew, and working with some very famous executive producers and directors that were engaged in this project. And so that was a 4-part series, and they were just unlucky before the GFC hit that one of the major shareholders pulled out.
Right.
And so they had to recalculate taking it off Broadway. And I think for me it was like, how do you pivot a story that you thought had an ending and bring another ending in that it isn't all doom and gloom. So that was like quite a big challenge as a director to do that. Yeah. But we achieved that, and having done that series, I then went on to do the one in Antarctica.
It's interesting. So it was 4-part series, and there was like an ending that sort of was planned out, but then that didn't happen. But in storytelling itself, it's always like you start here, you want to get to there, and there's an obstacle, and then you pivot, and there's another obstacle, and you change. And then when you reach your destination, or you may not, the realization will be something else a lot of times.
Yeah, but you could get to that destination and go, there's a huge obstacle. How are we going to end this, you know?
Yeah.
And that's what happened. And you realize how agile you have to be, and you have to be able to pivot and have some additional footage always shot in case you have to pivot. And I remember when this was going down, we weren't actually in New York, and we had to put a crew together. Within about 3 hours, we had to get someone on the street. We had to get somebody filming a DOP to capture what was going down. That was really a moment I remember. But again, I think that's all part of resilience. Like you have to think, how do I solve this? Because the problem isn't going to change.
That's why I really can relate with startups and filmmaking so closely. Is that, especially being a director, it's like being a startup founder. It can be a really stressful job, and you have to be managing sometimes like a huge amount of people and all this stuff going on, and you're the conductor of that orchestra, just like in a startup. And that's why I see so many similarities between the two.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point that you raised, Paul, because I know after doing the series that we did in Antarctica, I got a small grant with Screen Australia to look at doing a much bigger series on climate change. And it took me a little bit of time to find the angle. But I did a series called The Tipping Points, which was 6 1 hours. Such a privilege to have lived in the Amazon rainforest and dog sled across the Arctic and Greenland, which we can come to later. But to your point, when you go in these remote places, usually there's only 4 or 5 seats on the planes that we're taking in or out. If we're in Zodiacs, there's only 6 seats plus a safety person and another operator. So you actually, in very remote locations, on the sort of planning and places we were going to, I had to be the director, the producer, and kind of the mother of the crew, really, making sure everybody was okay. Yep. So you have to be able to manage these multiple roles, particularly if you're taking that leadership role, because someone has to do it. And if you're a startup or you're directing films in very far-flung places, you still have to remember there has to be someone who's actually leading.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, like when you said like a mother as well, I think the skills you develop being a mother can go a long way into dealing with all those sort of situations.
Yeah, I think that kind of slight angle of making sure everybody is nurtured. And I do remember, just jumping a little story, but we were flying in Greenland and we had to stop.
As you do.
As you do, yes, that's right. We were filming in Greenland for about 25 days and we're on the Greenland ice sheet, but we were then flying to a very remote place. You have to look it up. It's called Kanak, and it's the furthest village north in the world.
Is that a word, furthest?
I don't know, but I'll use it. I'll
take
it.
Now. I like it. Furthest. I love that.
But we were told that they only get 1 delivery in and out a year.
Oh my goodness.
1 delivery of food. Everybody has to do a shopping list for a year. And there was only 1 small little everything store there.
Yeah.
So they said you have to take your food in. So we stopped, as you do, the plane stops for an hour, and we raced to this massive kind of supermarket. I have to say, most of the things in the freezer I didn't recognize because they were like narwhal, seal, like whatever's. Okay. But I recognized the pastas and I made sure we got food.
Yeah.
And we had this massive box that we then couldn't fit in the little taxi that had taken us there. We had to put it up on the roof. Hilarious. But we got back to the plane.
Yeah.
And my point of that was I knew that when we got there, it was going to be challenging enough living where we were going to be, having to do breakfast, lunch and dinner every day and make sure that the crew had food and things that were going to be nourishing to eat because we were in 24 hours of daylight, but we were probably at -20 and it was going to be cold. They don't have flushing toilets there, so that's a whole other thing. And I just knew that everybody was going to be dealing with certain things. So I wanted to make sure I could have a really lovely breakfast and dinner for them every day.
Okay.
And we all mucked in to cook, but we needed the ingredients. And that's just all part of making sure everybody is looked after within the team.
Yeah. All right. And so what was next for you?
So after doing the Tipping Point series, we actually, our first episode was shot in Greenland. Extraordinary to be there. Then we spent nearly a month living in the Amazon rainforest.
That would have been amazing.
It was incredible.
But living like, with just bare minimal sort of stuff or?
Yeah, quite remote in many places. Yeah. I always remember we had a satellite phone and I always remember the phone going off and I realized it was somebody calling me from home. And it was my 9-year-old daughter asking me where her soccer shorts were. And I was just like, okay, so hang on a sec. I've got to just change, put my mothering hat on, tell her where the soccer shorts could possibly be. I always remember that was really quite funny. But you're always mum, doesn't matter wherever you are. Yeah. But after doing that, and we filmed in the Southern Ocean, we filmed all through the Himalayas in India, which was following kind of the shortages of water that were already starting to come off the glaciers and the mountains that really do provide a lot of the water for the farming in India.
Right.
And Africa, and where else did we film? After doing that big series, I have to admit, you talked about this before, looking after your own self and your own mental health and wellness and your own physicality. I think I put on some weight. I was working till midnight in the edit rooms. We were nearly a year in post-production, delivering to 9 different broadcasters. And at the end of it, I was actually exhausted. And I had to have a chat with myself and say, can I power on? Do I need to take some time out? And I realized I needed to recharge.
Yeah.
And I actually did step out of the industry for nearly 2 years.
Interesting.
And I just needed to do that because I felt that the project itself was nearly 5 years in pre-production, 2 years in filming, a year in post-production, and then traveling a little bit overseas to promote it in different countries. And I was very privileged to speak at the opening of Climate Week in New York in 2014, and James Cameron was there, and we shared stage. I felt like very privilleged to be there and
Sounds
and
like
talking with
he should
him.
be privileged.
I know. But, he said, we didn't have enough people. We only had 60 on this crew making this documentary. And he was trying to ask me how many I had, and I changed the subject because I was thinking, if I say to him 7 or 8, I couldn't go there.
He might admire you for doing that.
Or think I'm very crazy. But
Yeah.
I did recharge. And I have to admit that I thought in my recharge, I stepped in to do some strategy and marketing work while I was in recharge mode. But I just realized where my heart was, where my passion was really telling those stories about the changing climate system. And it happened at the same time that I was asked to show somebody around who had arrived from Singapore, who was engaged with the Earth Observatory of Singapore, which was doing amazing work on climate change across the region. And I did the tourist thing, this is the harbour, here's the Sydney Bridge, here's the Opera House, let's go have breakfast here, look out over the harbour. And we just chatted, and I understood that they were looking for a new artist in residence, somebody to come in with film skills to actually help expand the communications that they were doing on climate in the region. The person who'd been there was going back to LA, Hollywood. And as it just ended up being that I became the artist in residence for the Earth Observatory in Singapore. And that just really put me in the middle of all these scientists doing amazing work across the region and understanding more about the climate and the system and doing a lot more documentaries and podcasts and webinars with different institutions, academic institutions. So it was a very expansive time for me having that opportunity. I'm very grateful for having had it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's led you. I mean, you've got your own film company. I think you've made 55 documentaries altogether. Is that right?
That's right. Yes,
that's a lot, isn't it?
It has. As I was adding it up recently, I was like, have I really done that many? But yes, that's what I've done.
I can really relate to where you said you need a break. With my startup, it failed after 6 years, and then I needed a break as well. And then I was thinking, what will I do? And that's how I started this podcast. So. Who knows in the future what else I'll do? But I'm still a teenager, so.
Well, look, I was thinking what was my next step. Yep. But having had the experience of working kind of more globally, it's really been amazing to connect with the UN and the UN Oceans team and Exeter University, who I work closely with on tipping points, and just the connectiveness globally. I think sometimes it's harder for us, we're kind of in the south. There's a lot of more activity in the northern part of the world because there's a lot more landmass there, right?
Yeah.
And so having had the experience of being pivoting from Singapore and London, it's really connected me a lot more. And what I would say is, even in the startup phase, is to try and find those connecting links to
Yep.
other people who are doing things in the same area that you are in.
Collaboration.
That whole collaboration.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing in climate change. We have to work collaboratively because there are many people trying to do similar things, and we only have a finite amount of money to go towards saving the planet.
Yeah.
And collaboration and partnerships are really key. And I think once you get into that space and you're truly in that space and the people in there are very passionate, it kind of opens our eyes up because we realize that we're on a very short runway now. You know, it's like we had a much longer runway back in the 80s, the 90s, but that runway's got shorter and shorter to actually land the change we need. And we are in a time now where rapid transition is the only way out of what we're in.
Yeah, because you
And-
see every day in the world there's something going on, because of the shift in temperature, and like crazy tornadoes here and all sorts of stuff that that didn't happen to that degree before, and floods, and I think as I understand it, if we don't do anything soon, also like particularly the Asia Pacific region, it will, like the sea level could go up to like 2 meters or something, and a whole lot of islands and like I think millions and millions of people will be affected.
Yeah.
And so talking about that, so tell us about your latest documentary that you'll be releasing, I think the 31st of July.
Yes.
Tell us about that, and I think you won some awards with that as well.
Well, so thank you for asking about the film. I got to go back to Antarctica for a second time, and it was a pinch myself moment because I actually didn't think I'd ever get back there again. It was such a big dream. And for anyone listening, it's so hard to describe what Antarctica is really like. It's just like going to another planet. You cannot imagine a place like Antarctica exists because it is totally different to anywhere else on the planet, even different to the Arctic. And it is a massive continent that is twice the size of Australia.
Huge.
Plus, it has the Western Antarctica Peninsula. And that Western Antarctica Peninsula is kind of like Maldive Islands that all smashed together.
Right.
And they sit very low to the ocean, whereas East Antarctica is a massive continent, sits much higher up. And those points of distinction are important to understand when you think about how Antarctica, and many people thought it was just a sleeping giant, it's frozen, it's so far away, let's not worry about it. But the climate scientists and sea level started to notice changes, and changes happening quite fast. And NASA about 6 years ago put satellites up just to watch Antarctica, because Antarctica is only during summer able to be seen visually.
All right.
And then it has a long winter, which is 7 or 8 months where it's usually in darkness. So now the new satellite systems can see it in day or night.
Okay.
And they can track the changes in day or night. And so those changes, plus the teams on the ground there and other data systems that are being used to look at the reduction of size of glaciers, has told us that particularly the Western Antarctica Peninsula, it has these very long glacial arms that go out into the ocean. And the ocean comes in under those glacial arms. And so as the oceans are warming, all that ice that's frozen, but it's sitting in warming oceans, is rapidly melting.
Right.
And the first thing is, if we had on this table here a glass that was a certain temperature as the air, and we put an ice block in the glass or an ice block in the atmosphere, in the air, it'll melt nearly 100 times faster in water than it will in the same temperature in atmosphere.
Oh, interesting.
So it's very interesting. And so that's just to explain why these glaciers are really coming under rapid melt. And yes, they're melting. But the thing is that twofold is we're putting a lot more fresh water into the climate system, and the big ocean currents that run around the planet.
Yep.
Ocean and atmosphere are quite a coupled system. We still don't truly understand all of the interconnections between the two of them, but we know the ocean drives atmospheric change, and atmospheric change impacts the ocean. So they work together. They're quite a team, the two of them.
Yep.
But as you put more fresh water into salt water, it means the salt that's dropping down in the ocean current gets diluted. And I didn't know this until some time ago, but it's the actual dropping of the salt in the ocean that acts as a plunger, and it keeps pushing the ocean currents forward. So it's its own little mechanism. And when you start to dilute that, then the push of the ocean current starts to slow down and starts to get a bit weaker. And so you're starting to see some changes in the impact of ocean currents. And secondly, the role that particularly the Southern Ocean plays. 60% of the carbon dioxide that's stored in the ocean is stored in the southern Antarctic oceans.
Wow.
It's a very big carbon locker room down there. But as the warming oceans are warming up, the carbon isn't being stored down as deep as it used to be. So then you have different issues of acidification. So I don't want to get too complicated, but that melt and the rate of that melt is pushing sea level rise up. And we already know we're looking at a 2 to 3 metre rise by the end of this century.
It's frightening.
But if the Thwaite Glacier goes, which is the glacier that is being watched very closely in Antarctica on the Western Peninsula, it's like a butterfly. It sits in the middle, but it has long wings on either side of lots of other glaciers. If the middle goes, the others will fall in. And so that's where you can get rapid sea level rise on top of what's already predicted. So across Oceania, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Fiji, Cook Islands, Southeast Asia, eastern coast of Australia, there are concerns about how sea level rise will impact people, community, food security, water security, economic security. And these aren't just imaginative things. These are very, very identified through data and research of what is happening now.
Yeah, I don't think there's very many skeptics left these days. Like, there's so much information out there. And so your documentary highlights all that?
Yeah, so we went back to Antarctica with great crew, and we filmed the exploration of sea level rise. We also measured salinity, salt, ocean temperatures around the Western Antarctic Peninsula. And we did something which was a first. We set up and monitored microbes in the atmosphere in Antarctica. And so you might have heard about these atmospheric river systems, but with the winds changing, more moisture in the atmosphere. So when you've got moisture, more microbes can kind of ride on the moisture in the atmosphere. So trying to look at what is actually now being carried to Antarctica and how are those wind systems, what are the microbes, first time that research has ever been done. So that's featured as well in the film.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So that'll be released on 31st of July.
It will be.
Yeah.
It's a showing with the UN chapter here in New South Wales, and it's from 6 till 8 p.m. It's going to be at the Western Sydney CBD campus here in Parramatta.
Yep.
And there's going to be a wonderful panel of scientists as well. So, and young scientists and young people involved in reporting on climate as well. So we'll kind of span the gamut. But I think it's really important that we look at the game changers and the generation that are coming up now, that by 2030 are going to be so much part of change, and we encourage them and we give them the support and the knowledge to be those game changers.
Yeah, it certainly
we really
is needed.
need them.
It certainly is needed. And
yeah,
the work you're doing is really, really important. And you have an amazing story, and really appreciate you sharing that today, and working for an amazing cause. And so wish you all the best. I'm sure, I will be going to the premiere. So I'm sure it'll
you
be
better.
I already booked 2 tickets. I'm sure it'll be fantastic, and it was a real privilege to talk to you today, Liz, and thank you for sharing your journey and your passion in such an important area.
Oh, thank you, Paul. And if I can leave the last comment, is that action and hope work together. And we need action and we need hope. And for anyone listening to this conversation, find something that you can do, even if it's something small that you can do to be part of the solution. I just encourage everybody to think, what can I do? What can I do myself? What can I do in my household? What can I do in my community? And encourage those that have power in government, whether it's local or state or federal, to have the courage to make the changes we need to make now, and to support them on making the changes, because we need to move fast.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. So, So everybody get out there and do something, So action and hope together, that's the only way to go.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Liz.